Hello and welcome. My name is Lien Snej, and I'm the director of the Arts and Culture program at the Middle East Institute. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program that we are co-hosting in collaboration with the Center of Contemporary Arab Studies, the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. The event is being video recorded and will be available on our website, mei.edu, in video and podcast form. We ask that you silence your mobile devices, but we encourage you to tweet us at our new handle, MEI Arts and Culture. Before I get to today's event, I would like to give those of you who are not yet familiar with our arts and program a bit of context. Our program was established 3 years ago and focused on the vibrant art scene of the region. We believe in the power of the arts to build bridges and its ability to celebrate the rich cultural output of the region, while providing other ways for people in the US to connect with the region. We bring the work and voices of Middle East artists to the nation's capital and beyond, and offer different perspectives on the region, ones that transcend the dominant conversations around security. We program artist talks, film screenings, and panel conversations regularly. We also put on installations and art shows and are busy working towards a gallery for Middle Eastern modern and contemporary art housed at MEI to open in early 2019. This is part of a renovation and expansion project of our traditional home around the corner on N Street so as to accommodate MEI's rapidly growing activities and capabilities. If you have any questions about the program or the gallery, please come and find me or our Senior Vice President, Kate Seeley, sitting in the front here at the end of the talk. Turning to our program today, we will be examining the role and power of the dazzling and defiant protest art produced by Syrian artists and activists since the start of the Syrian uprising in 2011. In a nonviolent response to the brutality and tyranny of the regime, artists and activists responded with graffiti, cartoons, posters, and films, and connected with the international community through their art to make their voices heard. Recognizing the work's historic significance, the British Museum recently acquired a lot of the work that you will be seeing today and turned them into a unique exhibition, Living Histories, which was on show this past summer at the museum. Our conversation today will highlight and discuss the Syrian Art Archive and will examine the significance and implications of acquiring protest art by major art institutions. To speak about this, we are delighted to welcome again the London-based writer, editor covering the culture and politics of the Middle East, the multi-talented Malu Halasa, whose award-winning book, Syria Speaks, Art and Culture from the Frontline, which we programmed back in 2014 in Washington, D.C., with the support of the British Council, gave inspiration to the Syrian art collection. For her full biography, please refer to your flyers. Malu, thank you for being with us again today.
My great pleasure.
And about 30 minutes in our conversation, we will be calling in Venetia Porter, the British Museum Curator responsible for the collection of Islamic art, in particular of the Arab world and Turkey, and she will join our conversation. Last but not least, we would like to welcome and thank Sanjit Sethi, Director of the Corcoran School of Art and Design and George Washington University, for being with us and leading us in today's conversation and Q&A. A longtime arts advocate and educator, and a leader of a major art institution in the US, Sanjit's work is grounded in the belief that art can impact social change. I cannot think of a better moderator for our program today, so without further ado, I will turn to him and give him the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks to the Middle East Institute for hosting such a remarkable conversation. And I'm very much looking forward to tucking right into things. I just want to start before I hand things over to Malu for her to give an overview and show some of these incredibly powerful images of this work, just by setting up the scene, if you will, for a moment, by just saying that I don't think there's ever been a more important time to talk about the intersection regarding creativity and its response to armed conflict and such types of social turmoil than right now. And I think that's really important to keep in mind as we start to have this conversation. Creativity, be it performance or visual arts or through a design practice or an architecture practice, can offer keen insights, not just in response and reflection, but in actually driving possibilities for solutions, as well as opportunities to see how the poetics of discourses regarding creativity can also be instrumental in trying to create more tangible and long-lasting solutions. So, with that, I'm going to hand things over to Malu and ask her just to provide an overview of the exhibition, look at works with some highlights, and then I want to be able to engage in a conversation with her and then Venetia about some of the ways that this work has opportunities, but also some challenges and some interesting ways that how do we grapple with the idea of a collection of work that is dealing with such a powerful subject.
Well, first I'd like to thank the Middle East Institute for having me yet again. When our book, Syria Speaks, Art and Culture from the Frontline came out in 2014, we held a series of events here to celebrate the publication of the book and to also bring an American audience to this, to the Syrian uprising art that we were showing in the book. I want to give a background. Work doesn't just show up in a major institution. It has a journey that it has to take, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that journey. In 2013, exhibitions of Syrian uprising art started touring the UK and Europe. The first one that I worked on was held at the Prins Claus Fun Gallery in the Netherlands, and it was shown for 6 months. That went on to Denmark, where it was seen by 39,000 people during 2013 Easter week. But I wasn't the only person who was curating or co-curating exhibitions of this kind. Delphine Lekes, who works out of France, also had a very important exhibition called Syrian Anonymous Exhibition, Collective Exhibition and Video in Nottingham. And then there was also Charlotte Bank, an art historian, who had curated films for film festivals in Damascus. And she was also starting to show artist films and new cinema that was protest cinema that was coming out of the revolution. All of our exhibitions suffered from the same thing in terms of showing the work. Most of the artists had been showing over the internet, and it was difficult, if not impossible at times, to obtain high-resolution files. And so, Delphine ended up in Nottingham. She was printing political posters on newsprint, and I too had to print. I was gathering files from the artists. We were looking at a wide range of imagery, but we had to bring in the high res, and sometimes that was difficult because of the nature of the urgency of the art being made at the moment. So there was another exhibition that I helped with in London. It was called #WithoutWords, Emerging Syrian Artists. But that was an exhibition that showed painting. And it was held at P21, which was then a new Middle Eastern gallery in London. But because of the content, and because of the way, like I said, the urgency that this art was produced in, we were never, none of us, I think, were thinking at the time that a major institution would become involved. For today's presentation, I'm going to look at 4 of the Syrian artists collected by the British Museum's new archive on Syrian uprising art. And these are the artists that I've either worked with closely or an artist, one in particular who's been championed by Lekes and Bank. For the artists that I know, they were featured in our book, Syria Speaks, Art and Culture from the Frontline. And it was this book that Venetia Porter introduced to Camilla, the contemporary and modern Middle Eastern Art Acquisitions Group, which has been working very closely with the British Museum and with Venetia Porter. And it's really been the donors of Camilla and other patrons who have really been instrumental in putting up the funding so that the British Museum can acquire contemporary works of art from established and emerging artists from the region, artists that are either living in the countries of their birth or in the diaspora. I only have 25 minutes, so I'm going to move through quickly of the artists that I know and artists that I've been having a long relationship with. The first is Lafa Hejazi. Lafa was born in Damascus. She studied at the Higher Institute of the Dramatic Arts in Syria, where she majored in dramatic studies. But since 1997, she has been a writer and director of animation, television series, and other film and media production. And she has a particular focus on children's education and social development. During the Syrian uprising in 2011, when her family and friends were being arrested during the mass demonstrations, she made the following digital illustrations. And these are the illustrations, the next three, this image and the next two, have been acquired by the British Museum. Oh, is it? It's showing, it's fine.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Digital illustration, she told me, was easy to do because she was worried that there would be an unwanted knock on the door. So she did digital illustration because she said it was easy to hide in her machine. Soon after those mass demonstrations, she fled to Germany, where she continued her art studies at the Stadelschule Art Academy in Frankfurt, and she now lives in Berlin. So you can see that there's definitely there's a protest or a resistance motif throughout the work. But also she does draw on the 6 digital illustrations that were collected by the British Museum on Arab iconography like the Mesbah. In July, Lafa had her first solo exhibition, and it was called Animated Images in London. And Animated Images is her response to our changing relationship with new media. And Drops, I'm going to show, what I wanted to do today is I wanted to show some of the artwork that's been collected by the museum, but I also wanted to show you the new work that these artists are doing. And Drops is her new video. The next artist is Zahir Omarine. Zahir Omarine is a Syrian researcher and writer who has published articles and short stories in the Arab and English press. He's a filmmaker who has used internet footage in his art installation and assemblages. This artwork of the faces of the 1982 Hama massacre was one that was made specifically for Syria Speaks, Art and Culture from the Frontline, which Zahir was a main co-editor with me on. And his artistic response, particularly the way that he's shown the faces, was really in part due to copyright issues that we had that, you know, there are, over the internet, there are these posters of pictures in a grid of high school, not high school pictures, but school pictures, family portraitures of the people who were killed in 1982. But that was something that, the copyright issue when you're publishing something, that's something that you really have to think about. So this was the way that he responded. And when Venetia Porter saw this poster, she said, no, this was something that the museum would want to collect. For his, Zahir comes from Hama, and his short stories that he's written are also about the massacre, how, in terms of bedtime stories, how parents would tell their children, what kind of metaphorical stories they would tell their children so that they knew about the massacre. For his 2016 solo exhibition, X-Ray Syria, part of a wider British Council series showing art exhibitions that explore the roles that artists play in responding to conflict areas. In this video, Zahir addresses another contentious issue, the Syrian body. Oh, sorry.
When I woke up, I found myself in solitary. A small room, tighter than my body, paler than my face. No windows, no toilet, not even a hole. Smells like an eternal grave. Yellow and clingy, as though the walls were made by the slimy threads of slugs. When did all these shit start? Where were we when they built this web of fear? They covered my eyes with a blindfold. They made me take off my shoes. Then they gave them back to me. After they removed the shoelaces, afraid that I would use them to hang myself. At some point, I wish I had killed myself. It would have been easier than witnessing all that shit. 3 times a day, 25 seconds each, naked and under the jailer eyes and sticks. That was the gauntlet. You run on your way to the bathroom. It doesn't take mathematics. 75 seconds, that is the only free time you have per day. Everything became accepted. The sound of torture which never stopped, day and night. Am I the next one? Maybe. Don't sleep. Don't allow them the advantage of surprise. Waiting and staring at the high ceiling, where dirty neon lights obscured by the dust of ages are never switched off, flickering continuously like a swarm of mosquitoes inside my head. Who said prison is dark? It's a rumor. Darkness was a thing I wished for. Everything became normal. The unsalted food, the itchy scabies, the bruised, weak bodies, the sound and the smell of death that never ends. I became used to it, quicker than I expected. Then, one day, I hear the interrogator bell. Someone was being called back for torture. I had been there many times before. I knew it very well. Suddenly, the cell door opened. Blindfolded, I was taking out, my hair and mustache shaved. I was released. But outside didn't seem normal to me. By the building of the security forces branch, the streets were busy and dusty. A dry storm was coming. I looked down at my feet. There were shoes, but no shoes laces. All of a sudden, a blast of air whipped around the building, and a swirl of shoelaces, rubbish and plastic bags like a whirlwind made their way to the sky.
The next artist is Hamid Suleiman. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to show Hamid's work today is because many of the Syrian artists that I've worked with, they might have started with, pen and ink, or they might have started with digital illustration, but they've really gone on to video installation and moving image. Hamid Suleiman, who was born in Damascus in 1986, he studied architecture. He was the artist who had participated in the exhibition hashtag Without Words Emerging Syrian Artists at P21. And he was known to me first as a painter. So the top image is his painting Light After Dark from 2012. And again, it shows bodies huddled in a corridor of a police headquarters in Damascus. Suleiman had been imprisoned 3 times during the beginning phases of the uprising. And when he was accused of helping terrorists, he fled the country, and he now lives in Berlin, a city that's giving a home to many Syrian artists in exile. I've included at the bottom of the frame a couple of images from his new graphic novel, Freedom Hospital. And that has been that was published this summer by Jonathan Cape. And he told The Guardian that Freedom Hospital was really a way of imagining where he would be if he had stayed in Syria. And then he went on to explain. There is always this question, should I stay, should I leave, what are the dangers? If you believe in something this much, should you leave it? Each scene in the book, referring to Freedom Hospital, is a reaction to that question. For example, I drew footage from YouTube. This is because I was outside Syria watching footage of shelling and bombing in neighborhoods where I had friends I couldn't contact. For the British Museum archive, Hamid Suleiman gave an illustration where he's showing an early demonstration and people are holding up signs. He's the one artist who, like I said, is not really moving towards what would be considered the, not trendy, but the type of contemporary expression. He's going back to the drawn line, to black and white. The next artist that I'll be showing is Khalil Yunus. And Khalil is one of the artists that Syria Speaks has had a very long-term relationship with. And his pen and ink drawing, The Comb, was inspired by the amputation combs used during the US Civil War. And this was part of his series that was an ongoing series called Revolution 2011. And when Khalil was doing the work and when the series was ongoing, he felt that he wanted his pen and ink drawings to somehow capture what was going on in the Syrian Revolution in the same way that Goya had been able to capture what the wars that were taking place during his time. And it was a series that Khalil closed after he did a pen and ink drawing of a massacre in Aleppo where bodies, including those of children, showed up in a river with their hands tied behind their back. I had a very difficult conversation with Khalil the other night because he was telling me that he wants to repudiate the work that he did for Revolution 2011. And he worries that his art will somehow be added to the art that he considers, art pornography from the Syrian conflict. And so instead of documenting and drawing the war's brutal experience on other people, I'm not showing some of the other pen and ink drawings that Khalil did, where he was showing Hamza Bakur, or he was showing a young woman who had this part of her body like blown out. His images always use like a kind of very stark red and black, and some of the images are definitely hard to look at. But when we were putting the book together, I felt that his work was very important to show. And in many ways, because of the spotlight on Khalil Yunus's work, he feels that he has been, that he worries that Revolution 2011 has somehow spurred this, what he can only describe as art pornography in terms of the war. So instead of documenting other people's suffering, he's been turning inward, and his latest work reflects this trend. I wanted to show you a picture of the installation that he's done for #Kashash, which includes 22 Syrian artists on the historic pigeon breeders of Damascus, whose rooftop hideaways have been used as sniper nests. This exhibition was curated by Alma Salam and is now, I think, going on in Amsterdam, and it includes a big group of Syrian artists. The trouble with showing films from an installation, as probably you'll all understand, is that they really shouldn't be seen in a flat environment. So I wanted to show you how the installation is, how big it is in the room, and how the center of the film is really this corner. But before I show you his new film, I would like to read Khalil's accompanying artist statement. The detailed outer, and I should say the name of the work is They Primarily Feed on Seeds, Fruit, and Plants. And this is Khalil's statement. The detailed outer crust of existence bears witness to what was once there and now gone. In 1860, bodies were resurrected in Pompeii. Plaster casts were made by felling voids frozen in time, trapped under thick and heavy layers of ash, striking and real. The ashes' existence preserved their absence. They primarily feed on seeds, fruit, and plants is an attempt to consolidate the voids and define the outer crust of their surroundings' existence. It is dedicated to those who exist as impressions on our outer crusts. And this is the film that was put in the installation. The Syrian Uprising Art Archive at the British Museum throws up a multitude of questions. What is the function of art during conflict? And how should this art be considered? Of the moment, or within the context of a museum like the British Museum, forever? Has art from the Middle East become like literature, with an onus to reflect, comment on, or shed light on the time of its making? But what the archive did do and continues to do now is allow a platform for these kinds of questions to be asked and potentially answered. Thank you.
Well, that was great. It was fantastic to see that broad range of discourse and start to understand a little bit more clearly some of the motivations behind it. I want to start by asking you, if I could, and I think you started to touch on it in your final remarks, but and I think I was jokingly talking to you about this when we first met, but there's a notion of the Heisenberg Principle. I should see, those of you that have just joined us, there are plenty of open seats. Come on in, make yourself at home. Lots of seats. But there's an aspect of the Heisenberg Principle, if you will, in as much as how does the act of collecting work that's part of an active conflict right now? How does that work? How does the activity of collecting possibly change either the manner of production in the future or the way that work is being perceived more broadly?
I think that definitely being in the Syrian Uprising Art Archive in the British Museum for the artists has given them a kind of validation. And some of the artists are very pleased and happy about that because it means that they can go on to do the further work that they want. But from my conversation with Khalil Yunus, and that was the way that most artists, the artists that I've worked with, the artists that I've helped, what my job for the archive really was to do was that I was the one doing the printing again, because these were high resolution files that were coming in, and the British Museum only collects work on paper. So they're not interested in video art. They're not interested in well, I think in certain aspects they are interested in painting, but work on paper. So that for the majority of artists, this was a validation, and it meant that they would continue on in terms of some of them have a resistance theme that runs through their work, and they'll continue with that. For Khalil Yunus, it's something else. It's the opposite. And he's trying to think through now how he feels about that. The idea that images from Revolution 2011 are collected in the museum. He asked me, he said, how can I show that I'm different from that time? And my response to him, well, I was so shocked that he was talking to me about that, I was kind of silent throughout most of the conversation, but I said, the way that you show that you're a different artist is by doing new work, and that people will know that you are different. But so on for some artists, it's been a validation, but for Khalil, it's thrown up all these other questions. So what does it mean when the work's collected?
Right. What does it mean when it's collected within the context of work under the umbrella of talking about it being about conflict itself?
I guess that it's definitely seen through a definite prism, but the art of the other artists, I was showing very young and contemporary artists today. There are fine artists who have worked for the archive, like Assam Korbaj, who's always been working, that his work was collected before. And now, if you see in your handout Living Histories about the exhibition that the museum started showing some of the uprising art in that exhibition, there are artists that, or Yusuf Abdelki, who has been painting And these images of still lives, charcoal drawings, still lives with fish, they've also been collected, but they're seen within this context. I mean, there's work that is seen both outside the resistance context and inside.
Right. And I'm wondering, and I'm going to use a term that is used a lot, which is to focus on that idea around social justice. And I'm wondering if the work that's part of this collection you think provides a particular degree of illumination on issues around social justice within the Syrian conflict?
One of the things that we did for Syria Speaks is that we had a big section on prison memoir. That was something that it was hard to find. And I feel that the art also addresses, for example, what's been happening inside Syrian prisons in terms of the torture or the level of people who are being detained. And that's something that maybe those are issues that we wouldn't be focusing on if the Syrian artists and writers were not bringing it to our attention. So there is an element of that. But when we talk about social justice and we talk about resistance, I think that we're also taking away from the power of the work as art. And I think that's important to go back to, is that Venetia Porter, who is a very key curator for all of us who have an interest in Middle Eastern art, she's looking at art foremost. And I think that because it's an uprising art archive, we tend to look at the politics first. But this art would not be in the British Museum, nor would it have been included in a wider exhibition called Objects of Resistance at the Victoria and Albert Museum, if this work wasn't first and foremost artistic, and that when the viewer sees it, or when Venetia's seeing it, or whoever is seeing it, there is that art response, which is a very particular response that has nothing to do with context, conflict.
Sure, yeah. And that's a perfect segue for us to, let's bring in Venetia into the conversation. We've got her picture there. Venetia, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Excellent,
yes.
Excellent.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly, yeah. Everyone's just fixated on your picture and me. Because there's a very well-deserved degree of apprehension about technology, we'd sent Venetia some questions in advance, but for the sake of all of us, I'm gonna maybe start off, if I could, Venetia, by asking you that first question, and through that, then you can also go ahead and provide a greater degree of context in terms of from the British Museum's perspective and from your perspective as a curator about what this collection means to you. But I'll just start by saying, why would the British Museum acquire work about a conflict that's still unfolding?
Well, thank you. Thank you for this very interesting question. There's a bit of a kind of bounce back. So I'm hearing myself in duplicate, as it were. So, but I want to, first of all, for the opportunity to support in this really fascinating couple. And it's really wonderful to hear Malu talk about work. It's all a pleasure hearing Malu talk about the work that she does. So I want to thank you first of all, really. And I think we're talking about this as the Syria archive. I think it's important to see this in context of what we've been trying to do at the British Museum over a number of years. And that is that we're doing it through a particular prism. And the prism is our history museum. You can talk about what the museum is, a colonial institution and all of that, but essentially we are a history museum. And so what we have in the collection is material from all over the world over many centuries, but which in some ways of it is about history. And so this material, the Syrian material, and then perhaps we can also place it in the context of, can you still hear me?
Yes.
We can. You're cutting. We're basically losing the end of every statement a little bit.
Oh no. I'll talk a bit slower. Shall I talk slower?
Let's try that.
Hello?
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and try that, Venetia?
I've lost you.
We can hear you.
Shall I just keep going?
Yes.
Okay. Because I was hearing an echo, but it seems to be better now. Anyway,
right.
so
yeah, it's doing better.
Thank you, audience, for being so patient. It's a very strange experience talking to a grey screen, knowing that all these wonderful people are out there. So, but I'll try and be coherent in what I'm saying. So, what I was trying to say was, it's important to view this work that we've been collecting by Syrian artists within this kind of broader prism of what the British Museum is, which is a history museum. So can you hear me now? Can you just
perfectly? Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah, thank you.
And so when you think about us as a history museum, that actually my kind of broader aim, I have this kind of huge ambition really in terms of building this collection, not about the works just by Syrian artists, but also by Middle Eastern artists more broadly. As Malu was saying, I look at them first as art, but I also think of them as document as well. And my feeling is that what I would like to see in decades to come is people who are studying the politics of Syria or Iraq or Lebanon or all of these different places where there have been conflicts, Palestine and so on, that they will not only read all these heavy tomes and articles, but they will also look at art as well, because these artists have a very particular way of viewing the things that are around them. And so they will look at the worlds that they are inhabiting, whether they are in a conflict situation or whether they're sitting outside and looking in a very particular way. So I think we it is a difficult area in which to collect, and I've been for this Syrian material. We had a collection already of works by some Syrian artists, quite well-known ones like Fatih Mudarris and Yuhey Kayali and a few people like Ghazali Mukawas. But it was really this encounter with Malu, and I have to say that the first time I encountered the material was at the Prince Claus Foundation exhibition that she worked on, and an incredible kind of pamphlet that she created, she and her colleagues curated before they even got to the volume Syria Speaks. So it was when I saw that material to start with that I began to get a sense of, well, we should be trying to acquire this material. So, we are, the collection is quite modest, I have to say. We call it rather grandly the archive, but it is a modest collection which is trying to go in a number of different collections.
That's great. Thank you, Venetia. And the follow-up question I wanted to ask you is, what challenges and opportunities does a collection like this provide the British Museum as it tries to engage with the broader public? And I'm wondering if you could provide some specific examples or some specific challenges or some specific ways that you're thinking about approaching this.
Well, the first challenge was that Malu alluded it, and none of this would have been possible without her, was that when I saw these posters, they were reproductions from digital files, and as she said, we don't collect video, so there was no way that we could actually do anything with those files. So then the question was, well, how can we deal with this material? And we in a sense, you could say we turned it into something else. These posters, as I'm sure you know, they were created by the Syrian Collective, and they would be made, we don't know who these people are, and they would be printed out to take on demonstrations, depending on the size of your printer, but they were also, for the most part, circulating on Facebook and other social media, I think. So the first thing we needed to do, because our collection is work on paper, is to turn them into what are essentially artworks. So we've done something which people could actually criticize too. We've turned them into something else, but there was no way that we could otherwise actually have this group of material and that people could see. So even though we do, some of those posters, only 6 of them actually out of about 60 are on display. The rest can, in the future, because they're now prints, people can study them, come and look at them, and so on. So that was the first major challenge in trying to do this. But the other challenge is really finding the material. I mean, in order to try and do anything even remotely comprehensive, and we're not there yet by any means. I would not want to pretend that this is a comprehensive collection. This is just some examples of some works. Is that you do need to do a lot of research, and these works are not. These artists are not, apart from a very few of them, selling their work in major galleries. So it's dependent on people like Malu and Delphine and a few others who are researching and then bring works to my attention, or I'm not the only one. So, I mean, there are, for example, the collection, this incredible group of works by Lafa Hejazi are also in the Bardier collection, which is in Sharjah. So I guess those are some of the challenges in just building the collection, and then the other is in the perception of the material. But perhaps we can. I think that's another of your questions we can come to whenever you want to.
Right. Well, and what I want to do is also make sure that that this audience has a chance to ask the two of you questions as well. So what I'll do is maybe I'll ask one last question. I'll address it to both of you, and so you can both get a chance to respond. And then we'll go ahead and move to seeing if the audience has questions. I have a sheaf of questions which I'm happy to save for future conversations. But I guess that one is that it is about context, I guess, which is that we're in an age where oftentimes there's a propensity towards, whether it's disaster tourism or the ability to fetishize disparity, to fetishize conflict, and to fetishize disasters. And I guess I'm wondering what are the specific strategies that you're taking to go ahead and ensure that the way you're presenting this remarkable collection doesn't lend itself towards that type of fetishization?
Yeah. It's a very important question, this, and it was really, I would really welcome the conversation, to have a conversation with Khalil Yunus about it. I mean, when we made another acquisition fairly recently, which included works which are in this in the Living Histories display by Jabir al-Azmi, and the national newspaper which is based out of the UAE, immediately on it, the headline of the article was something like, British Museum is only collecting images of war. And which was, a little bit dispiriting. But in a sense, there is that perception that that's what we're doing. But at the same time, I think it's really important to actually represent the work that is being made. I mean, first of all, that it is art, but also that it tells these very powerful stories. And what was really interesting about when we first opened this Living Histories, the small display, is that we had, because this was one of the very few overtly political exhibitions that we'd done, we had it evaluated in a really systematic way. And because we were wondering about, what are members of the public coming to look at this? Because this display, it has to be said, it's quite a small area and it's within a gallery of Islamic art. So it's a bit of a shock when you're looking at kind of Islamic pottery and all of that, and then suddenly you'll come upon, Jabir al-Hazmi and these posters and, all of that. I mean, it's quite a big space, but it's within that context. So we wanted to try and understand, well, what do people think about that? And the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. And I've got the actually evaluation report in front of me, and I just wanted to read a couple of sentences from it, because it shows, in a sense, it was a validation for me and the work we're doing here, and also that of the donors who sort of paid for this material as well, that actually we are on the right course. So they were saying things like, museums are breathing and living places that should be representing contemporary issues for people to see and understand. Again, the Museum of World Art, whose focus shifts over time from plunder to art, you know, and it would be weird if we didn't include contemporary art about contemporary issues. So actually, that was actually really, really important to hear that voice from kind of random members of the public who happened on this display. But I totally of this kind of tourism. Sorry, okay, I'm stopping now. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
I can't really comment on the showing of this art like in the museum. I can only say that in the smaller exhibitions that I did, there was a very high criteria. You know, there were a lot of cartoons and comics that came out of the Syrian conflict, and a lot of it that I saw was inappropriate, that it wasn't really sending, not exactly sending the right message, but that the work was crude or was vulgar. And that's not to say, you know, I'm the author of The Secret Life of Syrian Lingerie, Intimacy and Design. I love vulgar. I love shabby. But, you know, and also in terms of Syria Speaks, there was a very intensive selection process. You know, we're not just gathering it all in because it's resistance, or gathering all in because it's against the regime. And I think that it's really in the selection process that you are able to identify themes, and that you are actually able to look at potentially awful issues, but through an art prism, so that more questions are asked after you're looking at the art, instead of narrowing it down to some kind of opinion.
Yeah.
Sure. That's great.
Yeah, I mean,
Go ahead,
the other
Venetia.
thing I just want to say is that it was part of one of the things that did come out was that when these people were being asked was actually that there is, you know how you get like donor fatigue? Well, you know, there is a kind of conflict fatigue as well. Yeah. And people are just not reading, you know, the newspapers for all the. There are so many awful things happening, and one of the things that was said by a couple of the respondents was that actually by looking at these artworks, it does definitely make us think about what's happening in Syria in a different way, and that was also very, very important to hear that kind of, you know, we've got you know, disaster tourism, but we've got conflict fatigue as well. You know, that is very, very serious.
And Venetia, can you talk? Can you give an example of some possibilities for public programming that you do specifically around the exhibition?
Well, I mean, we did a lot of talks actually, and actually Malu came to one and also spoke, which was nice. So we've done a good half a dozen talks, you know, in the exhibition itself, which is very kind of intimate place to do it, which is lovely. You know, you might get 30, 40 people, and that's great, and you have great dialogue and debate and so on. So that's been part of the public programming. We didn't do a conference, unfortunately. I mean, actually, as Syria Speaks was being launched, we did have at the British Museum, you know, a very, very nice evening with Malu and Zahir, and actually Khalil Yunus was there, I think, and Haysam Kurbad. So Haysam Kurbad is this very interesting Cambridge-based artist who created a wonderful little installation, which was part of the display, which was little boats made out of bicycle mudguards with matchsticks in them. So and that again was obviously, you can imagine, about, you know, people in boats leaving Syria. So public programming, you know, we just try and do quite small things around something like this, but you know, it would certainly benefit from a kind of major conference, I think, you know, looking at this kind of material more broadly and what it does. I mean, you've raised so many fascinating questions here.
Great, thank you. Let's open it up to the audience for questions.
There'll be a mic, I think,
There's a
so
mic going
Venetia
around?
can hear you. My voice is loud enough. No, we need you on the mic.
Thank you. When is this exhibition, we could actually view it all in its entirety and including the installation, or is that going to be just in pieces?
Can you hear, Venetia? Did you hear that question?
Could you just repeat that question?
Yeah, the question is about the duration of the exhibition. What's the duration? When's it? How long is it going to? And is there any intention for it to travel to the U.S.? Is that correct?
Well, actually, the exhibition it was supposed to close a couple of weeks ago, but it's actually still on, and I think it's going to stay on, for another month and a half or so. So it's still here. We haven't had any requests for it to travel anywhere, but we're always open to requests. All of the thing is that in a sense it can be done even without our collection as well as an idea. This material can be reproduced, brought together in different ways. So as Malu said at the beginning, there have been several exhibitions around this material. So I think it would be great if a version of it or of these or several of these could be shown in the States. It'd be fantastic.
Actually, I think the Living Histories exhibition has been on for nearly 6 months in the museum.
It has. I think it was in May. I think in May. It was kind of longer than normal, but it's good. Yeah.
Great. Yes, question in the back.
Yes. Are the artists themselves representative of a cross-section of Syrians ethnically, or are they predominantly of one group and of one locale?
That's for you, man.
Yeah.
I would say that the artists are. It's interesting that you ask that, because I don't talk to artists and say. Definitely, they're educated, many of them, but some of them are not. To tell you the truth, Christian or Muslim or I don't know. I don't tick boxes like that. It's a conflict which is so. Yes, it is a conflict that's divided. I'll say no. I understand. A lot of people, carry their ethnicity. Some people do. The artists that I've been dealing with do not. I was asked, Syria Speaks Art and Culture from the Front Line definitely is showing resistance art. And an American reporter asked me, well, what about art from the regime? Or on people who support the regime? And actually, I've looked at that art, and it didn't really speak to me. And I didn't think it was, maybe there are some new artists now that would speak to the audience, but I was not drawn in. That's not the reason why I looked for funding for that book or that I championed it for so long and worked hard for it. I was responding to the art that I felt was of a quality, but also that was a prism into the conflict. If you want to take an overview, there are many examples of regime-sponsored or regime or state-sponsored art or state-sponsored films. But I think that's a little different from the kind of artwork that drew me to it. And I also sort of felt that the art that we were showing in Syria Speaks, and you can see the copy of the book, was that it seemed to me it was more the voice of the people than the government institution or a particular political line. So in terms of dividing up the artists or seeing where they come from, there's definitely a geographic spread. The Syrians are highly educated, the ones that I've been dealing with, and some of them are definitely, they were educated inside the country and then were forced to flee because of the political situation or their participation in those mass demonstrations. And then there are some people who have been living and working like Issam Korbaj outside of the country. So, so it's hard for me to say this artist is Sunni or Druze or like that. But I do know that there are Armenian photographers. So I don't know if that answers it so clearly.
But I think that's one of the strengths of this is that it doesn't pander to the ethnicity route, which is what, of course, the regime has been doing. And I think it's really important that you don't ask that question first, that question might emerge in conversation, or in terms of when you look at the work, something might jump out at you there, which might give you a clue, but that's not the most important thing about the art. You know, religion and, you know, all of this is sectarian, it's a private matter for people. And that, you know, that's one of the things I've hugely admired about what Malu and her colleagues have done, actually, is they've looked at it in this very different way, which is people coming together against the regime and expressing their, you know, their art because of that.
We've got 3 questions that are on. Huh?
So I can't help but think of the artists as people, and they, by exposing them, by exhibiting their work, you have really put them in the limelight. Is this endangering their lives? Is this shutting down the possibility of them going back home eventually? How do they feel about going back home?
I can only tell you what's happened with Zahar Omarin's family, is that Omarin, for a long time, he worked under a pseudonym. And for Syria Speaks, he decided he wanted to use his name, his real name. And after the book came out in English and in Arabic, his family was called in by the security services. And so, you know, one of his members of his family was called in 3 times. And the 4th time, you know, Zahar said, it's time to go. So there's been a movement of the family out of the country, all sorts of people belonging to that family. For artists like Lafa Hejazi, I think her family is mostly out. And the writers that I know, they're out. Now there are artists. There's an artist film that I show that I'll probably be showing on Saturday at Georgetown, which is like a remarkable artist film by a young woman artist, but I don't know her name. But what I do know is that perhaps she's inside the country still. And the comic book collective, Comic for Syria, I know that the people are still there, and I know that, yes, they are in danger. But it depends on whether the regime is really looking at artists. You know, there are different groups that the regime addresses, so maybe in one sweep the artists are not really brought in, but in another sweep they are. So it depends. It's, you know, I won't lie, it's dangerous. You know, if you're doing books or exhibitions or you're showing this work, there's an element of that. And I think for Syria Speaks, it was really the first time. I mean, I'd done a book with Maziar Bahari, Transit Iran, Young Iran and its Transit Tehran, Young Iran and its Inspirations. And Maziar had been jailed in Iran, and the book came up during his interrogation, but he was let go. So, you know, it was the first time in Syria Speaks that I suddenly realized that, oh, that this does have far-reaching consequences. And yeah, my reaction to that, I felt, you know, I was devastated by that. But this work has to be shown, I feel. And if the Syrians I'm working with, they understand the dangers, and they weigh those dangers, but it's not their decision. I mean, I'm not saying it's all on them, because I champion the work and that I believe in it. It's also on me too. I have a responsibility. I have a responsibility to my editors and to the contributors to the book. So I do worry about that. But it's important that this work is seen. In our book, you know, you can see it online. You can see this work online, and you can see it maybe in a few art publications dotted around. But our book documents it, and this is what has been, that's what's entering institutions. And that's for me, that's one of the great values of the book, that it is a platform for the work and these voices that maybe having them just on the internet, not in one place, you don't feel the power of it.
Great. Next question.
I have a couple of questions. First question is, before 2011, Syria was already known as an emerging contemporary art hub in the Middle East. So is there hope that those artists prior to 2011 and the ensuing conflict will be helping the country to reconcile eventually if and when the conflict ends? That's my first question. And the second was something that Venetia Porter said. She said, she talked about disaster tourism and conflict fatigue. How can art help us in the West not get conflict fatigue and still be preoccupied enough to care about the people in Syria?
Venetia, why don't you take the second question? Why don't we take that one first?
Okay, so Malu, are you starting with that one, with the first one?
No, I was saying that why don't we talk about the question regarding disaster fatigue, disaster tourism, and conflict fatigue first.
Yeah. I mean, the question was how can art help? That's the essence of the question, isn't it?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, yes it is.
Yeah. So I mean, there are two things. One is that I think it's good for the artists if they've decided that actually they want their work to be known and they've worked that out. So I think it's very, very good that they should be represented in institutions and that their work becomes available for people to study and so on. I think in a very modest way, I think what it can do is to raise questions in the way that you're doing with this excellent debate this evening. Is that those people encountering Malu's book, those people who are seeing these works will start to think in different ways, and in the end, this. There is a perception that Syria is a complete disaster area, which of course it is in many places, but there are, one would hope for the future that artists will join with architects in terms of the rebuilding of their country and the rebuilding of civil society. So I think there is always, art is a very kind of a good thing, always. If it can contribute in a really broad sense to the sort of the rejuvenation, if that is the word. I can't think of the word really, but so I think it has to be able to help, really.
You're right that there was an art scene. I mean, I was talking earlier about Issa Tuma. He's a contemporary photographer. He was the first person to run a contemporary photography gallery in Aleppo. And he had been under the surveillance of the security forces when they had nothing better to do. There has been an art scene there. But what was really interesting about 2011 is how the Beirutis next door, suddenly there were all these exhibitions of Syrian painting by Syrians. And my friends in Beirut would call me up and they'd say, "Did you know that the Syrians painted so well?" And I found it really interesting that in a country right next door, no one had any idea of what was across the border. So maybe there were art, I know there were a few contemporary art galleries and people were working, but there was not like this international spotlight. Of course we've known of the charcoal paintings of Yusuf Abdelki, but no one really knew that there were people there that had been studying fine art and that they were producing this remarkable work. And it was something that one of my co-editors said to me, like before 2011, Syrians didn't like to talk to each other because they were fearful that maybe they would be reported on or the secret police or whatever. After 2011, everyone had to talk to each other because they needed to know what was going on. So I think in a funny way, the art scene too was kind of isolated. And then 2011, all the structures kind of broke down and that people were suddenly seeing more of the art. And like I said, the Beirutis were like, they were shocked that they didn't know about it. I was sort of shocked that they didn't know about it. So it's interesting how we know more.
I just wanted to add, sorry, it's just that you know, so I was in Syria before the uprisings, and one of the most important galleries there was run by somebody called Mona Atassi. And it was really groundbreaking what she was doing, but we have to remember the context, and that is, you know, that it was a repressive regime, so some artists just couldn't do what they wanted to do, but really the Mona Atassi has now, with her family, founded this incredible foundation, the Mona Atassi Foundation, or just the Atassi Foundation, and where they have been making their collection available for display. So it was recently on show in Dubai, because they have been systematically collecting the work of Syrian artists, going back actually to the late 19th and early 20th century Syrian artists, obviously a different genre altogether. But I think those, you know, somebody like this foundation really needs a lot of support and a lot of visibility, because what they've been collecting is absolutely the best in Syrian art, you know, across the decades, you know, from the modernist actually up until now.
And also, just to add a little bit to that, to what Venetia is saying, is Lafa Hejazi told me that the Atassis are putting together a show on Syrian women's art. And that one of the questions Mona Atassi has been asking is that how come before before 2011 there were some women artists, but afterwards it seems there's a flood of really good art by women. So where were they, and why are they talking now? Like, what has made them become visible and to express themselves? And so it's kind of interesting that the conflict, yes, it's awful, it's dangerous, it's horrible, but it also has had another kind of effect on the artists, that they want to show more work and that they're prolific.
Right. I think do we have one question here? And then I've got a couple things to say, maybe we can start to wrap up.
You both spoke to the importance of kind of the impact of digital art on the discourse surrounding protest art. However, this collection, you know, kind of, I wouldn't say discards that, but doesn't really look at the digital art side of things. How do you find yourself reconciling kind of that disparity and trying to show you know, some sides of that art while not necessarily having it present?
Venetia, do you want to talk about the importance of digital art in terms of...
Well, I think you know much more about that than I do, I think.
Okay. I think the internet was really key for all the Arab Spring / awakenings, in that before 2011, there was an official kind of Arab culture that would enter into the mainstream, and you had to speak a certain kind of proper Arabic, and also maybe in terms of the context of Syria, some of the art, there was not a regime involvement, but there had to be some kind of approval. That all fell apart in the way that the internet was used and the way that young people were communicating in slang. And I also think that I wrote an essay for Shifting Sands, which is a collection of essays edited by Raja Shahada and Penny Johnson. And I talk about how 2011 is the rise of Syrian street culture. In 2006, when I was doing Syrian lingerie, we were really looking at modes of manufacturing that was going on in the souk and in the little factories and the ateliers, right? But that was not really acknowledged. You know, people would joke about it, but it wasn't really acknowledged in terms of mainstream culture. And I think after 2011, suddenly comics, cartoons, even though Syria had Ali Farzad, you know, a well-known editorial cartoonist, you suddenly had all these young people putting together comic strips, and they told me that they were reading manga online in English translation. So when I said, oh, it must be because of Ali Farzad, they'd say, Ali Farzad, he's old. Like, why would we be involved with him? You know, so it's interesting how, like, I think that in terms of digital and the internet, it really provided an opening for voices that weren't so apparent before 2011. And I think that street culture, whether we're talking about graffiti, you know, the place of graffiti in the Syrian uprising has been well documented. I'm sure this audience knows about that. But that it was visible and that people were looking at it, and it still remains a viable, powerful art form today in the country is very interesting to me, because, you know, when did graffiti mean something in the West? It meant something in the 1970s. So this breakthrough, really, because of the digital and because of the internet, has really given rise to, I think, a generation's voice and artistic aesthetics. And I think that, for me, is the importance. But whether we say, I mean, like when I'm talking about Lafa Hejazi or I'm talking about graffiti, I am saying that it's digital and that that the internet is key. But in this context, where we're talking about fine art, to bring in the digital is somehow kind of a side discussion, perhaps?
Venetia, did you want to add anything to that?
No. I think what's interesting is just the variety of ways in which these artists are expressing themselves. So whether it's digital, you know, I'm sure you showed, Malu, the couple with the gas mask.
Yes.
I mean, you know, I knew people who were standing in front of that and practically weeping. It doesn't. I mean, what's so incredible about the form is that it's very kind of immediate, and there's something about the position of the two characters, and, you know, so yes, it's digital art, but you can only make really good digital art if you're actually a very clever artist too. So by calling it digital art, I wouldn't want to minimize it, actually, because it's what is behind that, and in the way that she was able to achieve her idea, really.
Great. Well, the first thing I want to do is give a round of applause to both Malu and Venetia.
Venetia.
I also want to make sure that all of you know that Malu is at the end of her book tour for Mother of All Pigs, a book that came out how long ago?
Oh, the 14th of November.
14th was very fresh. So she's at Writers and Books this evening. Is that right?
Politics and Prose at the Wharf.
Yeah, sorry. So anyways, but just to wrap things up, I mean, I think that this is an incredibly powerful body of work. And we've talked a lot about different nuanced territories here, but at least for me, in the end, a lot of this work is about the poetics of trauma. It's about the poetics of an intergenerational, multi-year conflict that sees no current end in sight. And it's powerful visually, it's powerful aesthetically, but it also provides a moment of reflection as to a broader sense of the poetics of our complacency. And I'm really, again, incredibly grateful for the Middle East Institute to put on such an incredibly relevant topic and to go ahead and bring two remarkable people to your forum. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Such a pleasure.
Thank you all for coming. I want to thank our remarkable speakers, Malu, Sanjit, Venetia, for joining us in this timely conversation, as Sanjit just mentioned. Thank you all. Keep an eye on our flyer. Come back to our events. Have a great day.
Thank you, Venetia.